In this video, we're going to address the similarities and the differences between the Gospel of John, often also called the fourth Gospel, and the Synoptic Gospels, namely Mark, Matthew, and Luke. So John, to be clear, is not one of the Synoptic Gospels. Remember, synoptic comes from the words seen together. We've spent a lot of time with our Gospel Parallels book where we have the Synoptic Gospels quite literally seen together, where they're put in rows and you can directly compare passages to one another. It is very, very rare that we can do this with the Gospel of John, that we can take a passage from John and line it up with something from the Synoptic Gospels. And this is why John is not one of the Synoptic Gospels. It does not appear to be using the Synoptic Gospels in literary fashion. There's some debate about whether or not John knows or has heard or has read the Synoptic Gospels, but it seems very, very clear that John is not taking a Synoptic Gospel and putting it into his Gospel the way that Matthew and Luke do with Mark. All that to say, there still are some pretty striking similarities between John and the Synoptic Gospels, and we're going to outline some of those first before we move on to the differences between John and the Synoptics. So we're going to do this by means of a Venn diagram, which you can see here on my screen, that we have John on one side, the Synoptics on the other, and the overlap between John and the Synoptics here. So let's zoom in a little bit and take a look at some of the similarities between the fourth Gospel and the first three Gospels. So in all of the Gospels, we have Jesus as Messiah and as the Son of God. In some Gospels, this is more explicitly stated than in others. John really likes to put titles for Jesus out there, but in all of the Gospels, we have these either explicitly or implicitly Jesus being Messiah and Jesus being the Son of God. All of the Gospels, what they center on is the life and the teachings of Jesus, and Jesus does powerful, miraculous things that intimate who he is or tell us something about his identity, namely as the Messiah and as the Son of God. All of the Gospels also feature Jesus and John the Baptist, and they also feature Jesus and John the Baptist at their beginnings. And so one of the things that this really suggests is that there is some kind of pretty strong historical relationship between Jesus and John the Baptist, insofar as John and the Synoptics include that relationship independently of one another. One of the shared accounts between all of the Gospels is Jesus feeding the 5,000. So the miraculous deed of Jesus multiplying food and feeding thousands of people. Then, of course, Jesus' death is by crucifixion in all of the Gospels, and it's by crucifixion outside of the holy city of Jerusalem. And what we'll see is that also in the Passion narrative, so in the account of Jesus' death, by crucifixion, the events leading it up to it, and the events following it, that there's a similar order of events between John and the Synoptics, that Jesus comes to Passover, or comes to Jerusalem for Passover, Jesus debates with religious leaders. This seems to get him in trouble with the religious leaders, who in some way, depending on the Gospels, sort of coordinate efforts with the Roman officials. Jesus is arrested, tried, and executed via crucifixion, and resurrects in all of the Gospel accounts. Very important detail there as well. Jesus is going to die around Passover in both the Synoptics and in John, and around is a sort of a wiggly term, that it's not very precise, because there are some slight differences about the timing of Jesus' death between John and the Synoptics. And so in John 13, we have before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew his hour is about to come. And then in John 18, Jesus doesn't enter, Caiaphas doesn't go into Pilate's headquarters because they wanted to not be defiled so that they could eat the Passover. And sort of the upshot of all this is when Jesus is crucified. Namely, Jesus is sort of presented as the Passover lamb in John, whereas Jesus in the Synoptics celebrates the Passover with his disciples in the Synoptic Gospels. And so we see this over here in Mark 14, and our parallels are going to be in Matthew 26 and in Luke 22. The disciples go and they make preparations for him to eat the Passover. And then sort of the implication then is Jesus' Last Supper in the Synoptics is in fact a Passover supper. And we don't have that same implication in the Gospel of John, where Jesus is presented as the slaughtered Passover lamb himself. The cleansing of the temple happens in both the Synoptics and in John, but they happen in different places here. So notice on my screen here, you can see my cursor that John 2 is where the clearing of the temple happens versus Luke 19. And if we were to put our parallel Mark and Matthew passages up there, we'd see that both in Mark and in Matthew, the clearing of the temple also happens towards the end of their respective Gospels. So we have a different timing of the clearing of the temple, though the event happens in both. And I've also highlighted a couple things here to sort of call your attention to, because they're going to be distinctive features of John later on. One here is my Father's house. So there's this close connection between Jesus as Son and God as Father in the Gospel of John. This is more repeated in John than it is in the Synoptics. We also have John often sort of characterizing Jewish groups, specifically Jewish leadership groups, as the Jews, whereas the Synoptics will often sort of name specific groups, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. John is more takes sort of this standoff overview approach and calls them the Jews. And so like Matthew's gospel, this part of John in particular has sort of been used to anti-Semitic ends in very negative and harmful ways. So over here, I highlight the leaders of the people in Luke rather than the phrase the Jews in John. And then highlighting here, sign. What sign can you show us? As we'll see in just a moment here, signs figure quite prominently in the Gospel of John. And then there's the calling of the first disciples, that in both John and in the Synoptics, Jesus' first act is to call disciples, but they're going to be a little bit different in John than they are in the Synoptics. So notice that Philip and Nathanael are the first disciples called here, as compared to what we have over in Mark with James and Simon. A couple other things are highlighted with respect to John. We have Jesus as the Lamb of God. This is going to be a theme we see repeated in John. We've already talked about it just a bit with Jesus being the Passover lamb. But this language of lamb is going to show up often in the Gospel of John. And we're also going to have more explicit titles for Jesus in John. John is not shy about saying who Jesus was, and he's not shy about having the disciples say who Jesus was, even from the very beginning. They call him the Messiah. They call him Rabbi, Son of God, King of Israel, Son of Man. These titles all get out there in John right from the get-there. There's no question about who Jesus is and the titles that are appended to him in the Gospel of John. And lastly, as to our similarities, we have the baptism and the beginning of Jesus' ministry happening in coordination with one another. The sort of embarking of Jesus' ministry in both the Synoptics and in John. So what kicks off Jesus' ministry is being baptized by John the Baptist. And again, this seems to go back to a historical relationship between Jesus and John. Maybe Jesus starting as sort of in John's circle and then breaking off to do his own ministry, but Jesus' ministry starts in John and in the Synoptics with Jesus being baptized by John. And again, I've highlighted a few things here. We see again the Jews as a sort of stock group in the Gospel of John. We see titles like Messiah. And we have here, but there is one among you whom you do not recognize, the one who is coming after me, whose sandal strap I am not worthy to untie. And then after this, John calling Jesus the Lamb of God. All of this seems to reflect a sort of tendency on John's part, to John, the writer of the gospel, to make it very explicit that John the Baptist recognizes he is lower than Jesus. This seems to be very important for the author of the fourth gospel, that we see it here. We also see it in the prologue, that in that sort of beautiful start to the fourth gospel, the author makes it clear that John is not the Word, that he only testified about the Word. And this is sort of one of the things that's characteristic of John. And scholars are going to say this might go back to this historical sort of relationship between a group of John and his followers and Jesus and his followers that's reflected in John, that the Johannine community wants to make sure and wants to make it very explicit that Jesus is above John, and that Jesus's followers are sort of are above John's followers in a way, and that John's followers should be sort of incorporated into the Jesus movement itself. That they don't want any confusion between Jesus and John the Baptist. And then, so to move on to our differences, and we're going to put the things that are unique to the Synoptics. So these are going to be absent from John. Jesus' birth is not narrated in John or in Mark. So remember, Mark just begins with Jesus' ministry. John begins with this this prologue, doesn't tell us anything about Jesus's birth, as do Matthew and Luke. The Synoptics are really going to center their action, their setting in Galilee. They have the temptation in the wilderness. This is wholly absent in the Gospel of John. The Transfiguration is also absent. Jesus predicting his death, predicting his suffering, death, and resurrection, which happens 3 times in the Gospel of Mark, is going to be wholly absent in the Gospel of John. And maybe surprisingly, Jesus does not teach in parables in the Gospel of John. So one of the things that we really sort of is characteristic of Jesus in our memories is him teaching in parables. This doesn't happen in John. Jesus teaches in different ways in the fourth gospel. There are no exorcisms in the Gospel of John, so demons are pretty well absent from the fourth gospel. Jesus predicting the fall of Jerusalem. Remember, this is one of our key dating points, especially for the Gospel of Mark. We don't have that prediction in the Gospel of John. And then to move to what is unique to the Gospel of John. Jesus' ministry lasts longer in the Gospel of John. We get the sense that Jesus' ministry is at least 3 years in the Gospel of John. In the Synoptics, Jesus only goes to Jerusalem one time, or at least we're only told that Jesus goes to Jerusalem one time, and it doesn't turn out so well for him when he does in the Synoptics. But in John, Jesus goes to Jerusalem 3 different times, and he goes to 3 different Passovers, suggesting at least 3 years of ministry in the Gospel of John. And speaking of Jerusalem, Jerusalem is going to figure very prominently, not only because Jesus is going there often, but also because the author of John seems to know the geography and seems to know things about the city of Jerusalem better than the Synoptic authors do. So this has led to some speculation about the identity of the author of John that we'll talk about in the next video. So John, of course, has this high Christological prologue, and I have included it here. I'm not going to read it for us, but remember John's sort of image as the eagle. It starts by soaring to the heights of Christology, where Jesus is equated with God in some kind of way. The authors of our textbook are going to challenge us in that assertion a little bit, but nonetheless, we have this very, very high Christology from the very beginning of the Gospel of John. We also only have in John Jesus turning water into wine. And this is significant not only because it's only in John, but also because it's Jesus's first miracle or first sign. So John doesn't really call Jesus's miracles miracles. He has a tendency to call them signs because signs are very important for the author of the fourth gospel. Signs point to something else. They indicate something about who Jesus is. So turning water into wine at Cana is the first of these signs. The raising of Lazarus is another one of these signs, and it's actually going to be the last sign, the seventh sign. I'm going to go back to what I just zoomed over really quick. Don't worry. But so we have changing the water into wine at Cana as the first sign, Lazarus being raised from the dead as the seventh sign, and all of these signs occur in the first 11 chapters of the Gospel of John before Jesus starts moving towards his death in Jerusalem in what follows, and what's going to be called the Book of Glory. But so we have these 7 different signs that point to Jesus' identity. The author names the first 2. The author explicitly says, this is the first sign Jesus did, this is the second sign Jesus did. And then from there on out, the author stops stating that these are signs, but it's pretty clear that they are signs in the mold of the first 2, which leads to the nice biblical number of 7 signs in the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John also has a number of I am sayings. So we see, again, the nice biblical number, 7 of these. These are on the lips of Jesus. He says, I am. In Greek, this is ego, eimi. This is one of those places where it sounds a whole lot like what Yahweh says his name is. In the Hebrew Bible, I am who I am. So maybe some hints of a high Christology here with the I am saying. But then also of relevance is what Jesus compares himself to. The bread of life, light of the world, gate of the sheep, good shepherd, resurrection and the life, way, truth, and the life, and then also the true vine. So all of these I am sayings with perhaps some high Christological implications to them only occur in the Gospel of John, as does the washing of the disciples' feet. So this, model of servant leadership only occurs in John chapter 13. We don't find the washing of the disciples' feet in the Synoptic Gospels. Nor do we find the Samaritan woman at the well. So this famous account of Jesus dialoguing with the Samaritan about where one is meant to worship only occurs in the Gospel of John, as does the account of doubting Thomas, of Thomas, saying that he's only going to believe if he puts his fingers in the hole in Jesus' side, and then does so in the Gospel of John, chapter 20. So whereas in the Synoptics, Jesus teaches in parables, and teaching in parables is absent in the Gospel of John, Jesus is going to teach in long discourses in the Gospel of John. And the Gospel of John is sort of going to be, in some ways, structured by these discourses of Jesus's teaching, these long, extended places where Jesus teaches. And then lastly here, the theme of love is exceedingly prominent in the Gospel of John. And I'm going to give you some numbers here. And I've also given you can see the Greek words, agape as the noun form of the word love, agapao, to love, in the verb form, and then agapetos is the adjectival form, the adjective beloved. So these 3 combined, the noun, the verb, and the adjective, are going to occur 12 times in Matthew, 7 times in Mark, and 16 times in Luke, and then an astounding 44 times in the Gospel of John. So almost 3 times more than in any other gospel. And this is also going to be reflected in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, that love is a very, very prominent theme in the Gospel of John and in the Johannine letters. Oh, sorry, I said last thing with love. That was not true. This bit about being thrown out of the synagogue on 3 different narrative occasions. Characters or the narrator sort of express concern about individuals who believe in Jesus or have some relationship with Jesus being thrown out of the synagogue. So this phrase, be put out of the synagogue. In Greek, it's apa, which is the preposition out of or from synagogos, from the synagogue, occurs in these three occasions, and it suggests to scholars that we're starting to see a sort of division between the synagogue and the church. So we've talked about in this class how the early Jesus movement is an intra-Jewish movement. It's within the bounds of Judaism. In some ways, with the Gospel of John, it seems we're seeing the beginnings of the partings of Christianity from Judaism. And some scholars think that this idea of people being cast out of the synagogue in the Gospel of John is a sort of reflection of that it shows the tension in perhaps one geographical area, perhaps wider, of Christians breaking away from the synagogue, or even in a forced way, that in certain synagogues the beliefs about Jesus were starting to perhaps be so high, that high Christology, and as to be blasphemous to some Jews, that Jesus was starting to be understood in terms that looked no longer quite like monotheism to them. And so we start to see that separating here, that may be indicated in this phrase, out of the synagogue. And lastly, again, sorry, I thought I was done with love, but we got one more here. We have this explicitly exalted Christology. We've seen this with respect to the I am sayings. We've seen it with respect to the Christological prologue, but we also see it in a couple of other sayings as well, where Jesus equates himself with the Father in some form or fashion. So in John 14, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Again in John 14, I am in the Father and the Father is in me. The Father and I are one in John 10. And then Jesus, of course, as the Word in the Christological prologue, and the Word being God, so that we have this strong equation of Jesus with the identity of God. And so to remind us of our different images, our different gospel images, we have Matthew beginning with a human genealogy of Jesus and being thus equated with a human teacher, also Jesus teaching often in the Gospel of Matthew. Mark begins with John the Baptist in the desert proclaiming loudly as a lion might do. And then Jesus in the Gospel of Mark goes from place to place quickly, doing powerful deeds. Luke, we have beginning with this sort of high priestly character. And so Jesus is presented as slowly moving towards his death as a sacrifice in the Gospel of Luke, so our slow plodding ox. And then John with its high Christology, so beginning with that prologue that seems to equate Jesus with God and somewhere soaring to the heights of Christology as an eagle soars in the sky. And so here we have again, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John is not shy to make high claims about Jesus and to attribute titles to Jesus, to have characters and to have the narrator say exactly who Jesus is. And I end here with this quote from Augustine, who talks about the Gospel of John sort of being so deep that an elephant can swim in it, that there's so much theological sophistication to John that it's like a pool. It's so deep an elephant could swim in it, but it's also shallow enough. We have these very explicit statements of who Jesus is, that it's sort of easy to it's a gospel that's easy to wade into, that a child can go into it and understand things about Jesus without drowning. So it's the Gospel of John is shallow enough for a child not to drown and deep enough for an elephant to swim.